All right, we're going to try and do part 3 of HEX history. This is mostly going to focus on the audit process, and I may touch on launch a little bit just because it was a big day for everybody. So audits and auditors. So security audits, I know Richard has said that they're akin to editors and that you want the best writers you can get, and then the editors don't matter as much. I would use a different analogy. So for me, working in software, security auditors are sort of like city inspectors. So you have a project and you know a lot and care a lot about that project. You are going to source, all the best materials that you can afford. You may have an idea of a way that you're going to set things up that meet your needs. And then you want the inspector to come in uh, to approve it, but also to give you feedback based on their knowledge of other projects. In the best case, they will know about failure modes that you don't know about. They will know that your neighbor is about to make some big change to their electrical or plumbing and it might affect you. They, unfortunately, are going to have their own preferences on, what you use, what equipment you use for particular jobs. And the process is about kind of negotiating with them, making sure they understand what you're trying to accomplish and finding ways that you can get certified, but still achieve your primary goal, whatever your goal is with your project. So with HEX, there were multiple audits. There were 2 independent companies that at first were operating without knowledge of what the other was doing so that you could get kind of that clean, independent eye. And then those results were shared, the results that the other folks didn't find, as a strategy. So the goal is you get both of them to independently identify anything that they see wrong, and then you tell the other one, almost like a hint, hey, the other folks were looking at this. Now that you know that, can you take a deeper look? And maybe you'll see something they didn't because you have this other background. So in that way, I feel like we covered every possible base. That was the goal up front, was to get independent eyes and then cross-check and then allow that to let them think a little more deeply. And then hopefully find everything, which there wasn't much to find. But let's say they did. Let's say they found everything. I shouldn't say that, like you should just trust me. Most of their focus, it'll become clear why I say that, most of their focus were on things that are not part of the system anymore. So the first year of HEX, the launch phase, had a lot more bells and whistles than the product does now. There were a lot of games built into that first year to try and get as many people onboarded so we could raise attention and then also make it advantageous for people to get in. So for example, there was a whole system that paid bonus interest based on the number of people and the amount of Bitcoin that was claimed, that was free claimed. So there were 2 independent bonuses. There was one for the amount of Bitcoin out of the total eligible that could be claimed. And there was another for the number of addresses eligible out of the total that could be claimed. The idea being you want big bag holders to claim, you want little guys to claim, and both of them positively impact their own returns for that. So minnows would tell their friends, a few whales get in, and big bonuses. That was one thing that the auditors fixated on. And they said, oh, if you hit a certain level of critical mass, there's some circumstances where it actually is less advantageous for the next person than it was for the prior people. And they were assuming like at 100% stake rate and 25% of all Bitcoin claimed and 25% of all Bitcoin holders claimed, you get into this weird scenario. So this is a super edge case, given that something like 1% or 2% of eligible Bitcoin claimed. And eligible doesn't count anything in multisig, for example, and doesn't count any, I think it's pay to script hash. There was an actual address type that was not eligible. Way outside of projections, and assumed 100% staking, which did not happen. So that was something that they pointed out. This will play into the theme that you may detect, that a lot of why it took a long time for the audits to be published was cleaning up their language. What we wanted from auditors was a list of facts. These are the things that will happen. If you do X, then Y will happen. So cleaning up editorial language of the bonus for Bitcoin claims is worse after a certain period. It's like, you can't say that. You need to say, in the event that 100% of people stake, or 80% of coins are staked, and at least this threshold, and at least this threshold, then the next entrant will be worse off than the prior entrant or something. So it's something just to say, you're not worse, you don't lose anything. It's just not more better. Like, more better for the next guy under these circumstances. You want very sterile language in these things, because you're not asking them to judge your idea. You're asking them to analyze outcomes given certain inputs. Let me think, what else did they find? So there was that was a little awkward. Both teams spent an enormous amount of time on the Bitcoin claim code. So the interest part, they're like, looks good, but you should use a standard arithmetic tool, which, put a pin in that. I'll get back to that. That's what I mean about preferences, about equipment lists. So they both basically lasered in on some of the onboarding bonuses and all the Bitcoin claim stuff. So the mechanism that people free claimed with their Bitcoin, we had a Bitcoin node that had some special code in it to consolidate the balances of UTXOs, so the unspent transaction outputs. For those who are either not technical or don't know much about the Bitcoin space, the way that Bitcoin stores your account balance is basically, you can think of it like you have a big pile of uncashed checks. So when somebody writes you a check, they take the entire balance of their account, of their bank account in this analogy. They write you a check for what you're owed and write themselves a check for the rest. So every time they make a payment, there's like a split in their bank account where they write themselves a check and then they write you a check. And what this ends up in is that you have a pile of uncashed checks that people have written to you and that you've written to yourself. And so your bank account balance, quote unquote, is virtual. It only lives in these uncashed checks. But because the system has perfect visibility of all the checks, it virtually can accumulate those into a balance. So you can view this balance on block explorers or in your wallet because it's doing the arithmetic for you. But the system is these uncashed checks. So we needed a custom node to basically do all of that arithmetic on the data and create an image or snapshot of everybody's account balance and sort of roll up all of the linked addresses or linked checks into a single balance, so that I said linked addresses, the linked checks together into a single balance, so that people could say, I hold X amount of Bitcoin at this address, and here's proof. I'll sign a thing that proves that I own that address. And the system can, in a very secure but simplified way verify that you're proving the thing that you say you're proving, that you hold a particular account balance. This is all done in kind of offline processing. It uses a structure called a Merkle tree where, well, I'm not going to explain Merkle trees on this video for security audits. So a Merkle tree is a structure that's used in a lot of cryptocurrencies because it's small. You can store a very small amount of data, and you can prove specific statements. You can prove that something is in the set of things that you care about very easily and efficiently. So the special node grinds up all the Bitcoin data for the snapshot, dumps it into this structure called a Merkle tree, and then it can save a tiny piece of data, just one hash, which is one fairly short string. It can store that permanently in the HEX contract. And this is what's kind of beautiful about these structures, that one string in the HEX contract is all you need. It's called the Merkle root. It's all you need to prove your Bitcoin claims. So you can take your address for Bitcoin. You can say, here was my balance at that time, and here's a sequence of data that, using the special Merkle process, should get chewed up and hashed down to exactly that string that's in the contract, and it's in the contract forever. And if it works, your claim works. And if it doesn't work, then you did something wrong. And it's that easy. So it's very cheap to store, and it takes very little computation to actually do it. Basically, all the audit attention was on this process. 90% was on this process. So both teams sort of took a really hard look at that. They brought to our attention a couple of published, nobody does it. I mean, there's no famous examples of this, but published attacks on that kind of data structure. And they had some suggested remediations that were, frankly, kind of ridiculous. We ended up solving it in, honestly, a very clever way. Both teams were like, oh, yeah, that'll do. So it was great. It was a very elegant solution to fix the problems. So both teams identified, one was what they call a pre-image attack, where you can kind of fake your way to the correct string and prove a Bitcoin balance that isn't real, that nobody actually has. So there's that kind of attack, totally defeated by the solution that we came up with. And the other one was that you could basically brute force a proof. So it was not a pre-image. That was a particular kind of attack. And the other one was brute force. And that one, I pointed out, was not actually feasible. A lot of people make this mistake, even professionals, where they think that if you have, say, 32 bits, they make this mistake that 64 bits is twice as hard. This isn't going to land if you're not technical. They make the mistake, the sort of arithmetic mistake, that if you're trying to find 64 bits of information, that's twice as hard as finding a random 32 bits of information. But it's actually the square. It's 32 squared hard. So like that was the only other critique. There was like, no. It was basically, you could brute force this. You can rent enough hash power off this well-known website to brute force a proof in 6 months or something. So before the end of launch phase, and get yourself some free HEX that you don't actually have claim on. And I just pointed out, it's actually the square, it's not double. So I think they resolved that in the audit. Let's see. So I said that was 90%. So there's a standard arithmetic tool used in contracts called Safe Math. It basically does checks that you are not attempting to go below 0, because all numbers in the Ethereum virtual machine are greater than 0. So if you try to get to like -2, you actually end up with some enormous number, because it like rolls over. If you imagine all zeros kind of rolls over to all nines. So it does all these checks on that. HEX does not use Safe Math, and there's a pretty good reason for it. If the HEX contract ever attempts to do arithmetic that doesn't make sense, then it's broken. The problem isn't that your transaction will fail, or that it does something out of bounds from like an arithmetic standpoint. The premise of the coin has failed. If you ever attempt to send, and the system was going to let you send more than you had, if the system was ever going to mint less than you're owed, if the system was ever going to mint more than you're owed, in a way that would break these arithmetic rules, then the system is bad. Safe Math, this is sort of a short-sightedness problem. If Safe Math was going to make the transaction throw an error, that, hey, you're trying to do something in arithmetic that's wrong, here, have some gas back, that didn't work, then it's broken. It's completely unacceptable to be in that situation. The goal is to have a trustless system that algorithmically produces inflation and then pays that as interest to a particular behavior. And if it is doing that wrong, then the whole thing is wrong. The underpinnings are wrong. So we got through that with exhaustive testing of all boundary cases that you can imagine, and probably a bunch that you wouldn't want to. So we just rejected that suggestion. It adds gas cost. It's small, but we're dealing with very high gas cost operations, which is the other thing that I'll get to in a second. We're dealing with operations like end stake and good accounting that can cost a lot of gas. So minor increases to give you protection against something that isn't really what you want. You don't want that kind of protection. You're just paying for nothing. You're paying to get the auditor to give it the okay, but that is a particular tool preference where we just said, we hear you. If we hit that situation, the system is broken anyway, so no thank you. We're not going to take that. For anyone who is looking at the code and sees that it's imported, it's not actually used anywhere. Safe Math is not used. It's imported because it was a dependency, or just came in as a dependency and part of the compilation for another Open Zeppelin contract. Let's see, so gas costs. So this is where the auditors actually paid for themselves, in my opinion, was they knew about Ethereum Improvement Proposal 1884. And this was the first big gas cost increase for loading data from the blockchain, from the database. One of the auditing teams said, hey, you know that having 50-year stakes is not going to work. That was the original spec, was 50 years. You could have a 50-year stake. And they said, yeah, there's this proposal in the pipeline. It's been approved, so it'll be in one of these forks. And it's going to triple the cost of loading your data. So figuring out daily payouts is going to be more expensive. If somebody actually has like a 25-year stake, it won't work. So it's going to cost too much gas. So that was actually an incredibly useful piece of information. And this is the kind of thing that you want your auditors to tell you about. Security folks are going to have their ear to the ground to different things than you. And that's what you want. You want their unbiased opinion on what a malicious person is going to try to do with your code. But you also want to know about the ecosystem in which you're operating. And this was something they knew that we just didn't really have we weren't looking at. I was new to the space at the time. Richard is always talking about how this is like, the first time he installed MetaMask or a wallet was to use his own product. We're just not steeped in the space. So this was great. I mean, it wasn't my money, but to me, that was worth the money all by itself. You don't get people in a situation that they can't get themselves out of, just because you didn't know about a particular thing. So there was the gas cost thing that they actually helped us out on. We told the other audit team about it. I guess they didn't know about it. They knew about some other potential change to some other opcodes that we don't use. So they also knew enough about the ecosystem, but it didn't affect us. So that's why the stake length 5,555 is the max length, is because of that. We ran tests with optimized contract to get under, I think it was under 8 million gas at the time, maybe 10. They've changed the gas limit since. And because we have to kind of project into the future what the Ethereum ecosystem is going to do, we had to be very conservative and make sure that we hit current gas limits. That's kind of assuming they never reduce the gas limits on a block. But it looked like the Ethereum folks were only ever going to increase that. So we have the gas costs. So the other audit that Richard talks about is the economics audit. So this is where he wanted a person specifically to make sure that the marketing claims about interest, so longer pays better, bigger pays better, make sure those are true and formalize them in a proof. And I believe that's published. So that one was challenging for different reasons. This is a sort of a math-centric person that we were working with, and we had to bring them up to speed, kind of on what it was trying to do. Initially, they had it modeled kind of strangely. They were doing sort of a heuristic scanning for outliers thing. So I ended up having to frame it for them. The system appears very complicated when you look at the code, and I think they were having a really hard time teasing out the thing they actually needed to prove. So I gave them the places to look. Here are the mechanisms. Share price being the one that you really need to fixate on to prove these things. There's the arithmetic around the bonuses. You look at that, you should be able to show that this only goes up and caps out, and then you're good. They showed that relatively easily. Showing the longer pays better was what was tough for two reasons. One, they started with this model where one staker was the only one acting in the system, where they would just stake and then unstake, stake and unstake. And they said, hey, if this person stakes longer, they don't make as much. It's broken. It doesn't do what you say. And, excuse me, that was where we had to point out, no. Inflation is only minted when they exit. So if they're the only person acting in the system, they're the only ones bringing that inflation into reality and thus compounding their inflation. And so that's why they end up with more. Do it with two people and see what happens. And then it's like, oh, it's comparative. It's comparative. It's not absolute. If you're the only person who stakes, you have control of the supply because you stake and unstake, stake and unstake. You are minting the inflation every time you do that. And the inflation only compounds once it's been minted. So this is why folks get a little confused whether it's a simple interest or compound interest system. It partially compounds every time somebody ends their stake. That's what creates the inflation. And then the next day's inflation number operates on that new supply. That's the only way it works. So if you get to these edge cases where it's only one person acting in the system, it's going to look weird. The thing to focus on, and the thing that we were able to draw their attention to, was the share price mechanism. That's easy to prove. I just gave him the formula. This proves it. This number, when you exit, will never be bigger than the number you started with. Here you go. And then also that you have to only consider multiple actors in the system. So if you look in that audit, there is verbiage about there's a weird case if only one staker is acting. That's a little bit of kind of covering their butt that they noticed that behavior. So that was a process. I think we've covered kind of all three ways that you can interact with auditors. They can bring their preferences, like tool preferences, and you can either accept or reject them. They can bring their own kind of misunderstanding. So you have to bring them on board. You have to get them up to speed on what the actual use cases are that you're worried about, and sort of narrow what they're looking at and say, yeah, no, we get it. You don't need to analyze that further. That behavior is intended. Look at this other thing, please. So there's pulling in their attention, and then there's their knowledge of the ecosystem that that you don't have, that you're not looking for, because it's normally not relevant to your project. So we really got to kind of stretch the skills and boundaries, I think, of what you can get out of auditors. And the only material fix that we made was to make sure that even though it was totally infeasible, just to make sure that the Bitcoin claiming thing was secure. Now that launch phase is over, all of that complicated stuff goes away, and we're just left with the interest and inflation mechanism, which is totally proven. I proved it. They proved it. It's proven. So it was a good process. I learned a lot about the industry, kind of positive and negative, that there are folks looking at these things. But that also it's a bit of a certification racket, or at least it was. I think there are more companies in the space, but there are only a few companies that could charge you an exorbitant amount of money to give you the stamp. And they wouldn't give you the stamp unless you agreed to some of the things that they were saying. And for example, that tool preference thing was a huge sticking point. They were very resistant to the idea that we could articulate why that was not important to the project, because those kinds of arithmetic failures represent total failure. So even if the library doesn't throw an error, something really bad has occurred if you have an arithmetic error. Yeah, so I think we got a lot out of it. The project should get a lot of cred, a lot more than it does, for going through that. Again, these were paid for up front. Everything was paid for up front and is done, set in stone forever. But you can go look at the artifacts of some of those audits. You can go find the old code, because the code's still there for all the things that they would have looked at. I said I was going to talk about launch, but this is already almost 30 minutes. Launch was funny. There was a little hiccup. I think folks lost 6 or 7 hours of the first day. Everyone was so frothy to get in on day one, but there were several hours lost just due to some Amazon Web Service stuff, getting all the websites set up and routing and everything else. And I think there was actually one false start. I think there was a contract published. If you go look at the contract, look at the address that deployed it. If memory serves, I think a contract was deployed, but it had incorrect generated data. So that contract address was never published because it wasn't right. So we had to, I think we went through it twice, got the true contract published, ran a few tests against it, made sure that everything was good to go. And then I think Richard went on stream. If I remember right, he read out the address character by character on a live stream, which, yeah, it sounds funny. It sounds real funny, especially given how the sacrifice phase went. He's like, just go to this website, you're good to go. Versus how careful he was with 0x2 B as in boy. Like, it was a good time. So hopefully this is informative. Yeah, hit me up with any questions. I know a lot about sort of security certification for software in general. So if you have questions about that or anything else, hit me up in the comments or email or Telegram, Rapid Prototype. Thanks.